Okay, so in this video, I'm going to do a couple examples of problems from this naming part 2 quiz. These probably aren't the same problems from your test, so just be aware of that, but I want to show you guys how to do it. So the first thing we need to do is figure out whether a compound is ionic or covalent. So in order to do that, an ionic compound, I'll just kind of type a little note here. If it's ionic, it's a metal and a nonmetal, and if it's covalent, it's two nonmetals. And so if we look at the periodic table, I'm going to use this one that I labeled for you guys that's in the folder for this quiz. The metals are everything to the left of this little staircase here, and then the nonmetals are this little green triangle and hydrogen too, because it's green. So what we need to do, if we're going to try to figure out if SCl2, if this is ionic or covalent, we need to see where on the periodic table sulfur and chlorine are. So sulfur is right here, and chlorine is right here. They're actually right next to each other, and they're both in this little green triangle, so that means they're both nonmetals. So since they are both nonmetals, this would be a covalent compound. Type in the wrong spot, covalent compound. So that's the first step. That's one of the 4 points for this problem, is just figuring out if it's ionic or covalent. The second step is the name. And so when you're naming a compound, the first element is always the same. So we can start, S is sulfur. So we can start by just putting sulfur. And if you don't know what the symbol stands for, you can find it on the periodic table. So S is right here, and it tells me right underneath it that the name is sulfur. And then chlorine is our second element, and if you guys remember, the second element, that ending changes to "ide." So sulfur chloride is where we're going to start. Now, if it is covalent only, I'm just going to kind of type some notes up here at the top as I talk. The prefixes are for covalent compounds only. So this one is covalent. So we're actually not done by just calling it sulfur chloride. There's a 2 here next to the chlorine. There's 2 chlorine. So we need to look at our prefixes, which are also in this folder with this quiz. There's a little chart with the prefixes, and figure out what the prefix is for 2. So the prefix for 1 is mono, but you can see here we don't use mono on the first element. So if the first element has no subscript, you don't use mono, you just leave it the same. So this is just nitrogen monoxide, and carbon dioxide are another example of that. If there's other subscripts next to the first element, though, you do still use the prefixes. So here we have dinitrogen trioxide and 2O3. So we have SCl2. So S is just 1. It's the first element, so we're not going to use mono. But for the Cl2, we are going to use di. So we're going to add that prefix to our name. So it's going to be sulfur dichloride. And that is our second point. So we've done half of the points for this problem. We have identified whether it's ionic or covalent, that's 1 point, and we named it, which is the other point. The other 2 points for a problem on this quiz are for drawing the Lewis structures. And a lot of people skipped that and just did the, whether it's ionic or covalent in the name. And the way this quiz is set up, since there's twice as many points possible as I'm grading it out of, you can actually do that. If you do every problem and you get them all right and you just do the naming part, you can actually get 100%. But if you only do 3 on each side, like the directions say, you need to make sure you do the whole problem, which includes the Lewis structure. So I'm going to show you guys how to do Lewis structures I'm going to do another example that's ionic too, and I'm going to show you guys the Lewis structures for both. And I want to point out this quiz, this video, I'm using this quiz as my example, but the naming part will also help you with, if we go back to our Unit 4 folder, if you need to make up this assignment naming covalent compounds, or if you need to make up the covalent Lewis structures, I'm covering that stuff in this video too. The quiz is covering, it's our final quiz for these two assignments. So you can do the Lewis structures, the naming, and the quiz based on what I'm covering in this video. All right, so to do our Lewis structure, we have S and Cl2. So I'm going to start by just drawing, I'm going to pull up my screen here so I can, but I'm going to start by just drawing S and then 2 Cl's, right? So the symbol for sulfur is S, and the formula tells me there's going to be 2 chlorine, right? SCl2. All right, so that's the first step when we're drawing a Lewis structure, is just writing all the symbols. The second step is looking at this labeled periodic table so we can figure out how many valence electrons the elements have. So that's the red number here on this labeled periodic table. And so sulfur is in the column with that red 6. So sulfur is going to have 6 valence electrons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if we go back and look at chlorine, it's in the column where there's a 7 up above. So it's going to have 7 valence electrons. So each chlorine will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so remember, with both types of bonds, we're trying to follow the octet rule. And that means that atoms want to have 8 valence electrons. So in a covalent compound, we're going to get the octet rule met and get everybody to have 8 valence electrons by sharing. And we show that by putting a circle around the 2 electrons that are being shared. Now, if you Google a Lewis structure, you might see it more like this with just a line. I don't want you guys to do it that way. I want you guys to use the circle because I think it's just a little bit more visual and it helps us understand what's happening. It's also a good way to show me that you actually have been following directions and you're not just trying to look it up. And you can use Google as a tool, but just be careful about what you see. You might not want to copy it word for word or exactly as you see. You can use Google as like a resource. So I drew these 2 bonds. I know I have to connect everything, right? It's going to be all one molecule. And I noticed that chlorine has 7 electrons. And so if it shares one pair with sulfur, then it is going to be able to have 8 electrons. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know if you guys can see these little green dots. 5, 6, 7, 8. And same thing with the other chlorine. It has 6 of its own electrons. And then it has these 2 that are being shared, so that it meets the octet rule. And we can also check sulfur. It has 1, 2, 3, 4 electrons of its own, and then 5, 6, 7, 8 that are being shared with the 2 chlorine. So this Lewis structure is done because we have every element is following the octet rule. They all have 8 valence electrons, and the whole thing is bonded together. And I think the covalent ones can be a little tricky. I would start by just writing out the valence electrons and trying to connect everything, right? If you have an empty electron, like once I get my mouse back, so I can point. There we go. If you have an empty electron pair, right? Like I have 2 pairs here, I have 2 pairs here, I have 2 pairs here. There's just 1 here. That shows me chlorine can make a bond here. And same with sulfur. There's these 2 electrons on their own. That shows me they can make a bond. And then I can count up at the end to make sure that everybody has 8. So that is a Lewis structure for SCl2. And I'm going to go ahead and put that, copy paste that into my quiz. And so this is a complete, you don't have to do the little check marks. That's just how I keep track that I'm following the octet rule. And then I'm going to paste my Lewis structure into my assignment here. And again, you can, if you're doing this, you can do it on paper. You don't have to do it on the computer. All right. So we'll do one more. We're going to do an ionic one, so I'm kind of giving it away, the second one here, this MgCl2. But let's review how to check if it's ionic or covalent. So ionic is a metal and a nonmetal, and a covalent is 2 nonmetals. So if I look on my periodic table, remember the little green triangle is the nonmetals. So magnesium is over here in this yellow column. So magnesium is a metal. And then chlorine, we already saw last time, it's in this little green triangle, it's a nonmetal. So since it's something from one from each side of the periodic table, it is ionic. It's a metal and a nonmetal, so it's ionic. Magnesium is a metal. And again, that's 1 point out of the 4 for the problem, is just saying it's ionic. The second part is our name. So we have MgCl2. The first element just stays the same, so Mg is magnesium. So I'm just going to type magnesium. And then same thing, chlorine becomes chloride. But this one's ionic, so I'm actually done here. I'm not going to go back and add the prefixes. Those prefixes are only for covalent compounds. So these two look pretty similar, SCl2 and MgCl2. This one is sulfur dichloride because it's covalent, but the MgCl2 is just magnesium chloride. There's no dye, there's no prefix because it's ionic. You only use the prefixes for covalent compounds. All right, and the last step is my Lewis structure. And people seemed to be more comfortable with the ionic Lewis structures, but I'll review how to do it just in case. We have same first step. We're gonna write out all of our symbols. So I'll switch back to blue just because I like that as a starting color. So we have one Mg and we have two Cls, same as before. And just like we did last time, we're going to look at our labeled periodic table to see how many valence electrons they have. So Mg is in the second column. There's kind of some writing underneath it, but you can see there's a little red 2 there. And then chlorine, we already saw, is in the 7th column, so it has 7 valence electrons. So I'm going to put 2 circles next to magnesium. I'll put 1 on either side. It doesn't really matter where you put them. And then my chlorine is each going to have 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So now with an ionic compound, the difference is we're giving electrons, right? So in covalent, you're going to see like every atom you're using is going to have lots of electrons, and the only way to meet the octet rule is going to be by sharing. If we shared in this one, right, if we shared this, then magnesium would actually only have 4. It would have 1, 2, 3, 4. So it wouldn't fulfill the octet rule. So what we do instead is we give the electron. Then magnesium can have a full octet underneath, right? There's another shell underneath here that it can have a full octet. So it's going to give an electron to this chlorine. It's going to give an electron to this chlorine. And now each chlorine has a full octet, and magnesium actually has a full octet underneath that. It's gotten rid of its 2 extra valence electrons, and there's a full shell of valence electrons underneath there. And then we want to write the charges. So magnesium lost 2 electrons, and electrons are negative. So we know that's going to be a charge of +2. And each chlorine gained an electron, and since electrons are negative, they're each going to have a charge of -1. And that is my completed Lewis structure for MgCl2. And if you're not sure how to figure out the charges, you can also just check the labeled periodic table. These little blue numbers tell you the charges. So you can see magnesium is in the 2nd column. You can see there's a little blue +2 there. And then chlorine is in the 7th column, and you can see there's this little blue -1 there. So you can just copy the charges right from the periodic table. And so this is my Lewis structure for magnesium chloride, and I will go ahead and drop it into my assignment so you guys can see what a completed problem should look like. A lot of people forget the charges. I took off half a point if you forgot the charges, so a lot of people did that. But I just took off half a point. And so here's my MgCl2. And again, feel free to, you definitely don't have to draw these on the computer. Feel free to do them on paper. So again, use the periodic table to figure out if it's ionic or covalent. If there's a metal, it's ionic. If they're both nonmetals, if they're both in that little green triangle, it's covalent. The first element, when you're naming, the first element stays the same, and the second one, the ending changes to "ide", so chlorine becomes chloride, oxygen would become oxide, and then if it's covalent only, you use those prefixes that are also found in this folder. So the labeled periodic table is right here, the little prefixes are right here. You use these only if it's covalent. So again, that's why we have sulfur dichloride, but magnesium, it's just chloride, there's no prefix. And then for your Lewis structure, you use the periodic table to figure out how many valence electrons to draw. You have to fulfill the octet rule, so in both types of Lewis structures, every atom is trying to get 8 valence electrons. In a covalent Lewis structure, we do that by sharing electrons. And in an ionic Lewis structure, we do that by giving electrons. So if it's ionic, your Lewis structure should have arrows to show electrons moving. Not a line. A lot of people draw lines. There needs to be a direction to see which direction they're going from. And then you write the charges. And then for covalent, you just draw the little circle to show that they're being shared. So that is hopefully everything you need to be successful on this quiz. And again, also in the Unit 4 folder, the quiz, the naming assignment, and the covalent Lewis structures assignment. This information should help with all 3 of those. And if you have any questions at all, please just send me a message and let me know, or we can meet on a Wednesday and I can